Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Beyond the Veil Background Information. We're doing our Angels and Demons profiles, and we're once again continuing with talking about Satan. So, for this one, we're talking about Satan as Satan, not as Lucifer. So, this is about the devil, and I've compressed as much of it as I can to try and focus just on what I've been using, but it's very difficult. To be honest, it's very convoluted. Uh, I took weeks to finish this because my brain just couldn't quite wrap around how I was preparing it for you. So I do apologise if it's a bit disjointed in places. But anyway, so as usual, I'll give you a quote from one of the stories where they're mentioned, and then I'll go into the information I've got here. Now, next time I will do the character profile, so my interpretation of them in the Veil, as well as talking about them in fiction, because fiction is generally what there's a lot of the big inspirations for developing this character. So hopefully that'll be interesting for you. So let's get into it. It's been a while since I've been hanging around this flesh parade, just because it's important. I'm Lucifer, aka the devil, but often titled Satan by the majority, and my pronouns are they, them, he, she, it. See, Belial, it's not that hard to work into an introduction, and being the beings we are, I think it's important they know gender doesn't work here. Quote from Reciprocity. So this is the hard part. And why is it the hard part? Well, for a start, we're talking about a being that's basically all the big bads in mythology rolled into one. It's difficult because the old mythology is to have encouraged the development of the devil, who always had a ruler of the underworld, and that figure was someone feared. Hades is a good example of someone who is not completely friendly and has shown a lack of empathy to human souls, and of course Hades and Tartarus are terms still used in regards to hell. But where does the devil as the polar opposite of God and heaven come from? Now, we've already discussed Satania and Lucifer, so you know that in the Old Testament there isn't really the big bad. If there was, then it was more than likely Baal rather than Lucifer. From that we know that the Satan are a type of testing spirit, but servants of Yahweh. And then with Lucifer we know the story of the fall is a trope in several mythologies, and is a story often linked to the morning star, or Venus visible in the sky, or a Babylonian king. Thus, Lucifer is a mistranslation. But to talk about the devil as the opposite number and remove the mythology of the fall, but to just focus on Satan the devil, we actually start with Zoroastrianism. Why there? Well, it's thought that the concept of a good heavenly being and a dark heavenly being, that there is a good and a bad, and it's not just temperamental gods, is thought to come from here. Known as agromania, this is a being in direct opposition to the spirit of creation, and sometimes the progenitor of Ahura Mazda. Agromania is linked to destruction and shows the division between good and bad within the concept. Of course, as time has gone by, Agromania becomes Ahriman, and well, it gets complicated, but the main point is the divide between good and evil. So why is this where we see the devil develop? Well, it's believed during the time of the Second Temple, when they were trapped in Babylon, and a lot of the Bible is thought to have been sat down and properly ascribed, the Persian influence of Zoroastrianism starts to bubble through and develop a bad guy. In the Old Testament, Satan exists as a type of angel sent to test virtue, as discussed when covering Satania. It is not a being out for revenge or to cause mischief, but purely to test faith. Satan and the devil just don't exist in the same way in the Old Testament as they do later. And yet, when it came to the time of prophets like Daniel, the influence and division of good and evil, that there was a being separate to God that caused all the evils in the world poked through. This worked with later texts to aid in demonizing other gods like Baal and developing the half Satan spirit into just Satan. One main force for evil influence into just Satan. One main force of evil influencing mankind. Suddenly, the Satan was developing away from the spirit ordered by God to a manifestation of all these evil forms and entities, drawing in from the serpent, bringing evil into the world. Thus, the serpent began to be pulled in too. Now, we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have the first indication of the Watchers, the corrupted angels, as well as the demonizing of other beings. The sect responsible for this, the Essenes, I don't know if I'm saying it right, developed the idea of there being an opposing force and naming entities within the entities known in the region to equate to an enemy of God influencing others. Were introduced to Belial within these texts, as mentioned, the Enochian Watchers, including the story of Azazel, the beginnings of a war in heaven, and that there was indeed an opposing being, and he had many servants, and introduces names like Beelzebub. We also hear of a full story. In this case, one of the names Mastema is introduced as an angel that thought to be as high as God, but was then pushed aside. Of course, this could be a mix-up as Mastema appears as well as a more angelic being within the role of judgment. We learn from the group too that there are elements of our teachings that are against the law of God, and these often include the more scientific information. Already we're seeing the developments for the Middle Ages demonology there. So within the old, so that's the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are apocrypha, as I know. But so within the Old Testament, Satan does not exist, but within the New Testament, and thus in Christianity, we begin to have a much more clear vision of there being an enemy, particularly a counterpart to Jesus. Paul's letters clearly refer to Satan as an entity, and of it interrupting their ministrations, and within the New Testament we encounter the stories of demonic possession, and that there is indeed an element working against man, and thus against God. The most important point of Satan in the Bible is during Jesus' time in the wilderness. Now, this is where Satan is truly given personification, a place as the enemy of God's plans, but in reality the actions are no different to the half Satan of the Old Testament sent to test Job. Satan appears to test Jesus' resolve and taunt him, goad him to prove his divinity and make it obvious why he is special. He is testing Jesus' faith in God as much as Jesus' own divinity. Mark, for example, points out that once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan. Within the wilderness, Jesus is tempted 3 times. However, as much as they are described as tempting, they're not much different to the role of the Satan spirit. The difference, though, is that Satan is described as having dominion over the world, and Jesus doesn't dispute his claim and thus seems to have the role to thwart him. The fact, too, that Mark refers to the demons working for Satan as legions starts to lean into the fact where Satan's role is a little too similar to that of the Romans who held dominion over the known world at the time. Do not believe in the God of the Jewish people and will eventually be the ones to execute Jesus under their rules. We also start seeing in the New Testament the prevalence of the number 3, the Trinity aspect, but also its link into demonology too. But Satan's role is strictly within the wilderness. If we get to the apocryphal texts, it's the source of a lot of chaos within Christianity and what really shapes the devil from every one of the varying sources around as the great dragon that's been hunting Jesus since birth. This is the Book of Revelations. Now, on a side note, someone turned up at my door recently on their mission to read me a little from Revelations, and I was polite to them, but the line they chose in its full context is not the happy thing it appears. Now, the Book of Revelations by John of Patmos is not actually in the New Testament of the Catholic Church, but appears in many other branches of Christianity because where the New Testament ends, this offers a view of the end, and thus of finality within the religion. Now, if you give absolute answers, you actually diminish faith, and thus this piece is a very confusing situation. But the basis for a lot when it comes to the devil. Revelations consolidates the war in heaven and the fall, and that Satan is the enemy to all and will punish sinners in something truly horrible, pulling in the ideas of the Greek and Roman Hades and underworld, and their ideas of punishment and cruelty that do not exist in, for example, Jewish ideas of after you die. Revelations gives us this ultimate goal of Satan, personifies the being in what are easily translated to the current political issues of the time when reading. Like Mark referring to the servants of Satan as legion and Satan having seeming dominion over the known world like the Romans of the time. And here, as Nero had exiled John for his preaching on Christianity and is well known historically for his hatred of Christians, It's not hard to see the similarity today. Some scholars even point out point to a piece of Judeo-Christian text thought to have been written around the same time, known as the Master of the Descension of Isaiah, the author believing themselves to be the prophet Isaiah, discussing similar apocalyptic motives with mentions of Samuel and Belial, and have also linked things to Nero. Basically, this chaotic time for Christianity's early days, it was always going to be a point to reflect upon, and using the biggest enemy to Christendom at the time and all his excesses to invent the role of an antichrist upon earth. And it helped develop the Satan as the opposite of God and working against man. There, making sense. But as the church develops and grows and Rome becomes interlinked with the religion, thus Satan sort of becomes the other, whomever the enemy is and whomever does not like them. There is the demonization of the Jewish people and the development of their role in Jesus' death, when he was prophesied to die, so this of course seems a really ridiculous form of persecution. But it is as we step into the Middle Ages and Rome has been sacked by pagan barbarians, when Christendom becomes linked to civilization and Satan becomes embodied by the non-Roman, the non-civilized, we start to see the developments of Satan as the one the witches obey, the one manipulating anyone who is against the Pope, the development of black masses, the hierarchy of hell, the seven deadly sins, and well, everything becomes built into the being known as Satan. In the Middle Ages, everything was pulled together to create this being that can be the personification of everything a society believing in Christ drives against. It becomes the bogeyman of the church, a way to separate the good from the bad and to encourage an idea of where following the church can prevent themselves from being steered down the wrong path. The concept of the underworld and fire in heaven are made even more clearer, and ancient gods from classical periods are converted into the image of the devil. Classically, Pan's half-goat features and lustful manners work to fit a tempter to lead people in the excesses that Christendom was against. We also have the devil being drawn into the position of the serpent. We have the Lilith story to mix in, and thus the corrupting force that we know as Satan as the devil is developed. Plus, the development of Satan allows the idea of there being just one God who wants to give salvation through his Son. So turn all the worst things that happen in life into the actions of this bad being, not the benevolent God. But I will say Lucifer and Satan don't actually link together until we get to the literature. So that is basically what Satan and the devil are by another in the Abrahamic faiths. Iblis, for being a later religion that could have developed a much more cohesive idea between God's love and God's wrath, Islam is Iblis as the leader of the Shaitan or devils. Iblis was once a member of heaven, but when requested to bow before Adam and recognize man as the ultimate creation of the Almighty, Iblis refuses. For this disobedience, Iblis is thrown out of heaven, and thus his hatred for man is pretty straightforward. Through this, Iblis is shown as prideful too, for he is a being made of fire, Adam made of clay, and there is a seeming thought that for existing longer, for being obedient to the Almighty, and thus being superior in that sense, being asked about is to wound the ego, and is often what means theologians like to link Iblis and Christian Satan. Iblis is, with this linked to Christian Satan, linked to the Jewish concept of Satan, although he and his fellows disobey, and indeed to Mara, the manifestation of temptation in Buddhism, linked via Sufism. Iblis, it's a much more interesting concept, and it's actually something that I would encourage you to sit down and read about, because despite being linked quite a lot as having a similar role to tempt and help divide between those that will go to hell and those that will go to paradise, I would debate them being that similar, but certainly Iblis feels like they are much more separate, though performing similar duties. Satan as the devil is very much they're performing similar duties. Satan as the devil is very much creation of Christianity, and neither Iblis nor the half Satan are as related as some might think, especially modernly. Certainly, I would say when it comes to understanding where Satan as the big bad comes from, it's for the same reason as in politics we choose someone to point at and well demonize. Satan as the bad is the ultimate political tool to pull people back into the church and give an easy answer to the common sentiment of, if God is benevolent, then why does God let this happen? I would suggest looking into Andy Hamilton's Search for Satan. It sums up things far more comfortably than I could, and certainly is more enjoyable, and I would admit probably far more cohesive, but there are plenty of books out there. In fact, there's a great deal of discussion over it all, and I'll be honest, this is my understanding of the being and their influence towards my use of them. Final comments. I'll be honest. Most of my understanding when it comes to revelations is by those who are not writing about theology. My father was a historian specialising in ancient history with a great understanding of revelations and has taught me a lot about it, as well as also teach me about Thomas of Aquinas and stuff like that. So I didn't know how to reference him in the sources, but he's one of my big ones for understanding where Revelation stands in like looking at it and say, well, it's very much linking to Nero at this time, isn't it? So I hope that's helpful. And thank you very much for listening and coping with me through this.